Welcome back to Pull Up with Miles and Owen. This is episode 33. We've got another very special guest, a women's basketball writer, formerly of The Athletic, with bylines wherever you read about sports, a huge women's sports advocate, and the author of several books, which includes co-authoring alongside Frankie de la Cretaz, Hail Mary, The Rise and Fall of the National Women's Football League. Welcome, welcome, welcome. Thank you for joining us, Lyndsey D'Arcangelo.
Yeah, I'm glad we did this. About time.
It
It
is
is
about time. It's time.
long overdue. We're so excited to have you on. So I wanted to start here. This is actually perfect because the first question we had was about the evolution of women's sports and its coverage. And then you said something 5 minutes ago before we started recording. You said the wick for this explosion was lit years ago. And I just wrote that down because I love that. Um, this is not a good reporter question to start off on, but I just want you to elaborate on that quote. The wick for this explosion was lit years ago, and what did you see years ago that has led to where we are now in this current moment?
Yeah, I think, I really started to see a shift in coverage, particularly with the WNBA. I want to say 2017, the preseason leading up to the preseason, leading up to the regular season, you started to see more mainstream articles being written about players, about teams, and things of that nature. And there was a little bit more attention being paid. And I'm not really sure what the shift was because, like, along with like the growth in viewership, like it started happening. And I could really trace it back to that because I was like, oh, this is interesting. And then the year after that, and the year after that, and it just kept growing and growing and growing. So we're talking even before, and I'm going to throw her name out there because, it's part of the conversation. And Caitlin Clark even got to Iowa in 2020. There was growth happening. Um, yes, it was happening at a slower pace, but evolution and growth, those things take time, and so that's why I say that the wick was lit a long time ago because there was this spark, right? And it sort of slowly burned a bit until it got to a point where you have a generational class of talent entering the league now, and then you see all those players at the college level coming up. I mean, it's all part of the mix and part of the explosion that we see happening now.
I think I brought this up maybe on another pod, but there was a clip that I loved going around after the draft that I believe it was Janae Sims who was asking players, draftees, if they could create a 3-on-3 team, who would they pick? And I think Caitlin was the only one that picked men. Everyone else picked current WNBA players or people they'd played with in college. And I think that was where I started to notice the shift in the last couple of years from a reporting side is the access was not always there for the WNBA. And I feel like that might be around that time, right? Where young girls coming up that wanted to play professionally were then able to watch the league and learn the players, learn the legends in a way that it's not it can be easier to find some of these games, but they're on. And that wasn't always the case. And there's we could probably point to 1,000 reasons. We can look back to Sedona Prince showing in the like before the tournament what their tiny weight room was a couple of years back compared to what we saw with these viewership numbers in the championship now. But yeah, I feel like we remember Sabrina in the New York market being Caitlin before Caitlin and bringing that kind of energy. And I had gone from being one of 3 reporters the year before on Zooms to seeing 24, and then she gets hurt 3 games in, and it kind of dwindles back down to where it was before. But that growth, it's been steady. It's been weirdly linear. Like we have seen, it almost never feels like that will happen where you're just kind of on this roller coaster ride going up and up and up. But it feels like the sport has been. It's just kind of caught fire. And Caitlin and that phenomenon has been huge for kind of skyrocketing the coverage. But that would also be ignoring some of the other huge storylines like Angel Reese and what's going on in Chicago with their whole following, or what we're seeing in LA with their duo with Cam Brink, with Rakia Jackson. This whole rookie class brought it, and we know that next year is going to do that, and then we know the year after that is going to do that. So the connection of the pipeline, college to pro, and the W had a hard time really for a long time connecting those fans from college and then bringing them to the pros. How, in your eyes, have you seen that shift? Have you seen that change? And why do you think that's changed in the last couple of years?
Yeah, it's funny because when you were talking, I was thinking how college players, a few years back, you would ask them about their WNBA counterpart, or who they admire most, or who they want to be like, that kind of thing. Run of the mill questions for college players, and a lot of them wouldn't know the names of WNBA players, or current. And I think, to tie into the viewership with that, also in, like, I feel like 2018, 2019, we started seeing the expansion of putting games on television where people could find them, like more games being broadcast, the addition of like League Pass and things like that. Accessibility and visibility is a huge key part of this conversation. So the more that these players become familiar with, WNBA players, the more they get to know them. And social media, we have to factor that into it. I feel like social media has helped as well, as far as players having their own voices and their own, sharing their own personalities and platforms that didn't exist before. But yeah, I definitely have seen a shift now where, there is more of a connection, and I think part of that, is on the league. Like, I mean, we could have a whole side conversation how they failed to capitalize on a lot of these moments and these things that have been happening, and like now are starting to kind of get the bigger picture. Um, One of the things that was always brought up to me was the chicken or the egg conversation, which I can't stand, and it has been proven false. But do you wait, for more fans and then increase visibility and put more games on TV and yada yada yada? Or do you do that first and then the fans will come? Well, obviously what we have seen is you do that first, because that's the way this thing has played out. And add into, like, Zoom in 2020, like that whole boom. It's so much more accessible to watch press conferences, to stream. The Toronto announcement was streamed on Facebook and wherever you could find it. And I would love to see the numbers on that. I don't know if you guys have seen that, but that was huge. So the advent of technology has a lot to do with it as well.
I think that that's true also from a media access perspective, because we were talking before we started recording about you being remote and some of the challenges that could present. But with 2020, with COVID, and then everything shifting over to Zoom with the bubble, I think all teams have kept some remote component of these press conferences too, which is really good for reporters that can't be in market because not there aren't enough jobs in the space. And there are, I believe, only Kareem and Annie are the only reporters that will travel with their team. So if you're looking for coverage of a specific team, then that becomes impossible if you're relying on whoever's local, because these press conferences are then happening concurrently. So if you're going to skip the home presser to go to the road presser, it would just limit so much of the coverage. So that, I think, is also a really good point in terms of getting to that next level of storytelling too. But back at the top, I had mentioned that you have had bylines basically everywhere. You've been in the sport fighting for coverage of women's sports. You've been in this space. That, I know, could not have been easy, because we've also been focusing on just like one very narrow conversation in terms of we kind of threw ourselves behind the W and we're like, women's basketball, that's kind of where we're at. You've seen a lot of the growth among other women's sports. But what was your journey to get to, or what were some of the challenges maybe that you faced in just getting into the room and saying this is something that should be covered in a way that it's not being covered right now?
Yeah, I think, for me, a lot of it was, and this is back when, I was still pitching articles at different sites, and, sending emails and saying, this is happening. This would make a great, article, feature, column for your readers, yada, yada, yada. It was more about convincing people that these stories mattered and needed to be told. And that's why I say again that, this wick has been burning, because throughout, before I started with The Athletic in 2018, just writing, with that being my main platform. Before that, I was pitching everywhere to, ESPN, The Ringer, the old Deadspin, even some women's type media sites that I felt there was a way to tie in some sports there as well. And it was a matter of, there was a lot of, I want to say hand holding, but there was a lot of convincing needed to be done. But then I saw the shift where, I would get a byline, and then they would reach out to me, asking me, oh, do you want to do something else? Do you want to do another feature? So that was cool to see, because you saw the growth happening in real time. And I think then after joining The Athletic, and then them creating their WNBA vertical in 2019, which I'm so proud to be a part of and had been a part of, that sort of opened up the door even more. Sorry, my dog is in the background,
Totally fine. This is a
We
dog
love
friendly
it.
show.
whining a little bit.
Yeah, I love that. I mean, going back to that period of I think about that 2017, 2018, 2019 stretch as well, because COVID changed a lot of things, and then I think we really started to see the rapid ascension in terms of numbers, anecdotally, just in terms of interest, in our lives. But in terms of that wick being lit, going back to that point, I think about this a lot. The shot that Morgan William hit to end UConn's streak, I think, is a huge turning point. Like the way in which the Final Four became the most exciting thing in sports. Arike Gumbawale hitting her 2 shots the next year, and then the Aces moving to Las Vegas and Asia Wilson being there after winning a championship at South Carolina. There were so many elements in those years, Stewie coming into the league, that set the groundwork for the stuff we see now. And so again, and it's the players that were before them. It's the fact that you had Minnesota and Los Angeles in these finals back-to-back years, and the number of storylines and superstars there. And this gets at one of the reasons we're so excited to have you on. And I think that anyone who follows you on Twitter or reads your work can see your passion for storytelling come through, and accessing the deeper elements of what goes into this work and what goes into sports. It's not just, the game itself, but it's the people. So how do you approach the art of storytelling? What is your goal when you're setting off on pitching a feature and reporting on a feature and writing a feature? How do you want to do the best by who you are writing about?
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, so when I was pitching, I would, highlight whatever key elements that were already known about this player and why they were intriguing. But what always happens when you're writing a feature, so much other comes out, so much other things and pieces to the puzzle come out during the conversation. One of my favorite things is when I'm interviewing somebody and we're having, really a lot of it is just a back and forth talk. I mean, yes, I have questions laid out of important things I want to ask, but then out of the conversation, new questions arise, and you could take a whole other off ramp to to a whole other side of the story. And that's so much fun. And it's just like, I've always loved the human side of athletes, even growing up, playing sports myself, but, being a big sports fan and watching all types of sports. I love football too. I always just loved learning more about the athlete off the field, off the court, etc. and who they were as individuals, because I find that just as fascinating, right? We're all human. And yes, they are incredibly talented and they can, they're really great at a certain sport, but like, who are they individually, and what drives them, and what happened in their lives? I mean, it makes them all that more relatable, you know? And that's what I always aim to do in a feature, is show the human side, whatever that may be. It could be something as simple as Candace Parker telling me she's such a raging competitor that even when she's on a Peloton bike, she's like looking at some anonymous person, Pedals by Patty, and she's got she can't let Pedals by Patty beat her in a Peloton race. Like, and she's like demonstrating, during the conversation. I was like, that kind of thing. Like, I love those little tidbits, and because who among us wouldn't want to beat Pedals by Patty on the Peloton bike? But you know what I mean? Like those things. And obviously there's more serious stuff, like elements that come out. But all of it, it's all part of it. And that's something that I just always wanted to do. That was my goal with every feature.
You might have just answered it, but I was going to ask as a follow-up for a couple of your favorite anecdotes that you've kind of run into over the years, because that is always the most fun. When you're in that conversation, you're like, oh, this moment that's happening right now, like this is going to be my lead.
Oh yes.
This is going to be what I pull from this story when I'm sharing it on social. And that's just such a great feeling, because you're like, I don't know how we got here, but I'm gonna take credit for it.
Yes, you guys know as writers, like, yeah, you can be in the middle of conversation and like someone says something, you're like, there it is. That's my lead.
Yeah.
There's been so many, I've gotten so many nuggets out of any Diana Taurasi story I've ever written, whether it's with her or about her or through the view of other players. There's just so many good nuggets. Man, who was I talking to? I was doing a feature on a player, and it had nothing to do with Diana Taurasi. She was just talking about, the conversation eventually led to her having looked up to Diana Taurasi, and um, you know, eventually getting to play against her in the WNBA. And she talked about how one of the things during the game that she would get so frustrated because Diana, she's a physical player. We all know how Diana is. But at the same time, she did this thing where she was against the Washington Mystics. She was running back on D, and Mike, the head, head coach of the Mystics. Why am I blanking on his name right now? That's so funny.
Like Tebow?
Tebow. He was frustrated, and Diana looked right at him and was like, "These nuts!" Like yelled "these nuts" at him. Which has like a double entendre, right? D's nuts, like and like just went like that at him, and yeah. So, and that came out of total left field. I mean, I interviewed Sue Wicks once for a feature, and she was talking about how she was running like a clam farm now, and I don't know if she still does it now because this was a few years ago, but it was part of her business. And she's like, "Yeah, come on out and visit me, and come to my I'll take you clamming. I'll take you out to a nice nice dinner and all this stuff." And I was like, oh, this is kind of cool. I mean, stuff like that. And then becoming familiar with these players and these coaches and whoever, where next thing you know, they're in your phone. And I'm texting Lyndsey Whalen just to get a feedback about something, or like a quote on a random Tuesday afternoon, all of that. It's all part of it. And it's just so much fun. And you come to realize, like I said, these athletes, they're so talented, but they're also just regular people.
Yeah, yeah. Shout out to Sue Wicks, who we were actually talking last week to Sandy Brondello about, ahead of Teaspoon coming back when Chicago was playing in New York. Sue Wicks is at basically every Liberty home game at this point, and the support that she's shown, and just the bridging of the first generation of the Liberty to now is really awesome for these players to see. When you talk about kind of building that narrative thread, it all really starts there.
Mm-hmm.
And also to Diana, because like we ask every player that comes on for their welcome to the W story, and I wonder what percentage of the league, because D has been around for so long would have her be a part of the middle of their welcome to the W story.
Like
It's like
90%.
40%, right? It would be a ridiculous number because of who she is as a competitor and also her longevity, just all of it
Yep.
combined.
Yeah.
But to to jump to another topic, the rise of women's sports, it feels like we've talked about the W, but it feels like it's been manifesting in very different ways because the W was kind of this low and slow, but then was building and building and building and now got us to this point where we're at. And then the NWSL just had a ton of investment, and it feels like two new franchises every year are kind of popping up. It became almost like a niche celebrity thing to become part investor, and that's been awesome for their growth. And then the PWHL, which, if I'm completely honest, I'm shocked that it came together, first of all, as quickly as it did, because when they said, like, in 6 months, we're going to be running and we're not going to, like, we don't know where our franchises are going to be, but it's going to be happening. And then it did. Um, After the previous merger, what are some similarities or key differences that you've seen from across these three leagues, and what is sustainable in terms of just the growth in general?
Yeah, I think one of these things, and this I learned a lot in writing the book about the National Women's Football League from the 1970s. One thing that women's leagues have never fully been afforded, well, it's three things actually, is time. Well, two things: time and investment. Right, those are the two main crucial things. Most people who start a franchise or a league on the women's side expect it to be profitable overnight and expect a return on investment and for it to grow overnight. And yet, if you look at throughout history, men's leagues have taken decades. Like the NBA was not $1 billion enterprise when it first began. Neither was the NFL. Like Major League Soccer, like you could go through all of them, and they took time to get to where they are now. Franchises came and went. Many failed, but we look at women's leagues and we have a completely different point of view because they're women's leagues. It never made sense to me, and so I feel like people still point to the WNBA and talk about losing money, and even though the growth and valuation since 2018 2019 has been huge, it's so easy. They're not even in their 30th year to say, well, they should be this or they should be that. But I think, and what we've seen change is the investment piece, right? That's always been part of it. You have to invest and pour money into something in order to eventually get it back, to see it grow and get that money back, or to expand and all this stuff. Sports leagues are no different. And we're finally seeing like a variety of different people and companies and entities or whatever invest in women's sports. And that money coming in has allowed for faster growth. The time element will always be a key piece. We'll see what happens over time. But I think what the WNBA did and what they established, and kind of like the pitfalls and then the successes, that other leagues have sort of looked at that as a blueprint. The NWSL, I think, has sort of taken pointers away from that. I think the new hockey league, there's a new volleyball league, like all of them. You learn from the past. You learn what you could do differently. They're also starting in a different age, off of a bigger springboard, I think, with social media. We can't pretend that hasn't been a huge help to the WNBA's growth, especially over the past, however, 10 years, really 5, but that's made a huge difference. So I think you learn from history and you learn what you could do differently, and then tie that in with companies finally investing and finally putting money where they want to see, where water your garden, that kind of thing, all those cliches. So to see the NWSL it looks like they're having more success at a quicker pace, but I think they also are doing things a little bit differently. And then, capitalizing on where soccer is now too. I mean, it's an extremely popular sport. Um, it's just a fun time to be in women's sports on the whole, and to see where things can go from here, even more so.
I think framing the discussion around the pillars of time and investment is such a good way of putting it. If you and the way those work in tandem strikes
Yeah.
me too. Like you see at the start of the WNBA, the investment is there for a few years. Everyone's super excited. The advertising budgets, the NBA is pushing it, and then that just evaporates. They lose interest, and the way in which the time element is weaponized because of the lack of investment and the lack of care taken to grow the league, to water the grass, is really striking, and I don't think people acknowledge that enough when they talk about like the down years of the W just from a numbers perspective. Um, and I think that we think about these pillars of time and investment all the time in media. Like it's just as important to be investing in this storytelling from a media perspective, and to be taking the time and the care to tell these stories, to just let everyone know, hey, this is really cool. Like you guys should be watching this. This is some of the best, stuff happening in the sports world. In writing about the National Women's Football League, what were some of the joys of that experience for you? And did you feel, I'm sure it was rewarding, and I'd be curious to hear any sort of feedback you got, or just like appreciation from people being like, oh, you care, like you care enough to tell this story that a lot of people might not have known about or may have forgotten about, kind of just got lost because of a lack of investment and because so much time has passed.
Yeah, I mean, you summed it up perfectly. We heard that from the players. I mean, really, that was the impetus. These players did something at a time when it seemed wildly impossible that they could ever do it. I mean, Title IX had just passed. So women weren't supposed to be playing sports, let alone uh, tackle football. And they did it at a time when, it was crossing with feminism, the feminist movement, and just a lot of social movements happening all at once. And really, the bottom line, and what we heard from pretty much almost every player we talked to, was all they wanted to do was have a chance to play football. They loved the sport, but they were told they didn't belong in this sport because they happened to be women. And as somebody who grew up loving football and was told, I have a twin brother, and when we were both 8 years old, he got to play in a tackle football league, and I was told I couldn't because I was a girl, and because my parents didn't want me to get hurt. Meanwhile, I was already playing tackle football with the boys in the neighborhood in backyard lots and whatever. So the hurt thing was kind of ridiculous, but that has always been a driving factor for me. Like, because I was born a woman, like I couldn't partake in a sport. Like it made no sense to me even at that young age. And so it was very rewarding in that sense to hear these players' stories about how they did it anyway. I mean, they pretty much gave a metaphorical middle finger to men and to society in general by participating in this league, which is awesome, and it's radical, and it's an integral part of sports history, particularly women's sports history. And there's a clip going around on Twitter today, or maybe it was shared last night, I don't remember, but Sue Bird was talking about why they started together, and the content company that she started with 3 other athletes. And she basically said, we wanted to put our money where our mouths are. There are stories to tell, and we want to tell those stories. This Hail Mary is one of those stories. I can't tell you how many people I still brush up to today who are like, I never knew that league existed. Well, of course not. No one ever wrote about it. No one ever talked about it before. Even though you can go back and scroll through endless newspapers where there were gamers, and there were horribly written columns about these women. That's another topic. But it was there. It just got lost. It got lost in the mix. So that was the impetus.
I do think that there is, and this might be just going way off where the conversation is right now, but there is a conversation to be had about when there is coverage, what that coverage looks like, and if so much of that conversation is about what these women look like and what they should be doing, and not about the sport itself or about their journeys to the sport itself. Um, but in terms of writing this book about a league that had been gone for decades already, what were some of the difficulties that you and Frankie ran into in terms of pitching, in terms of finding a market for this? Because I imagine that it was not the first phone call that you made where they were like, "Okay, let's do this. Let's move forward with this," but that you guys really had to be creative and really show your dedication to this material to get that go ahead.
Yeah, our first book proposal was not about this league. It was about women in football in general. Just all the strides that have been made from coaching to playing to commentating to being analysts. But our agent, was this is too broad. And Frankie had stumbled onto this league writing an article for a magazine. I forget which one, but they're the one who said, I think this is it. I think there's this team that they were covering, but there's this league. So when did this league take place? And so we started researching it, and it just was very clear that this was the story that needed to be told. So we reworked the entire book proposal, and our agent was still, this is back in 2018, 2019, before we sold it, was like, I don't know that publishers are going to see the gift of this story. I don't, because it's women's sports, and because it's football of all sports. um I don't know if there's an audience for it. And then we put as much of convincing material into the book proposal as possible, and then when she went out to market with it, we had to go to an auction. There were 5 different publishers who wanted to publish this. Um, and that was, like I said, back in, because the book was published in 2021. So that was probably 2019 when we got the book deal. Fast forward to now, I mean, I feel like that we just missed that window by that much, because now it's even now publishers are like, oh, women's sports. That's the topic of conversation. And that's how the publishing industry works. You got it. They go with what's popular and what's being talked about. But now, like, women's sports are exploding, and I think it's it's less hard to sell a book or to sell a concept of a women's sports book now than it was back then. um, but yeah, we had a feeling that the topic and the story itself was not only right for the time, but also something that never had been written about before. That also worked in our favor.
It's funny that you bring up just like trying to time that moment perfectly, because when I was in college, a senior in college, I worked at a literary agency, so I was in charge of all the slush pile stuff, and we had a running tab. This was 2011, and we just had a post-it note that we would just add a check mark whenever we got another like young adult vampire romance, because this was in the Twilight era, and everyone was like, all right, this has been written, now you need to like be creative, go back to the drawing board. But yeah, the supernatural romance from for middle schoolers, high schoolers was all anybody was writing at the time, because they were trying to catch that wave, but it had already crested. You have to anticipate and then like fall into the moment and hope the world kind of stays there with you. But a follow-up that I had on that is the co-writing experience is something that's fascinating to me. I'm always very, very interested in how that process works. And I remember reading an interview between Neil Gaiman and Terry Pratchett when they worked together on Good Omens, and how they literally would just email each other back and forth like, I wrote this chapter, now it's your turn, and they would just be almost like pen pals. But then I know sometimes it's a more organic thing, or here's where my specialty is, where does yours lie, I want to do this research. How was that process for you and Frankie?
Yeah, it's exactly how you described it. I mean, it's kind of serendipitous how this came together. Um, basically Frankie and I met in a old Facebook group for women and marginalized sports writers where everybody like would just bounce ideas off of each other and support, share articles, stuff like that. Um,
Love
and
that. I love that.
yeah, it was cool. I mean, lots of people that you know now were in it. Sarah Spain was in it. Um, Shake over at the Chicago Tribune was in it. Katie Barnes was in it.
Wow.
It was when all of us were sort of just getting started and coming up. It was kind of cool. Um,
Elite group.
Elite, yeah. And then it sort of fell apart. No, it just Lyndsey Gibbs was in it. Like it just sort of everybody sort of just it went by the wayside. Twitter became really more popular and all that. But anyway, we first met in that, and so even after that, we would bounce ideas off of each other, and then Frankie was working on an article and asked me, they knew I was knowledgeable about football and was asking me if there were any books on women in football. And I said, no, they don't exist. Like there are none. The ones you would find is, learn football so you could like talk to your boyfriend, stuff like that. I'm not even joking. Those types of books. So I said to Frankie, you should write one. And Frankie was like, well, maybe you should write it with me. And that was how it all got started. And then we sort of just started joking back and forth, but then being a little bit more serious about it. And then that's how the first book proposal came out. But yeah, we had never written anything together. We have two completely different writing styles, interest, and in the way we work. I never missed a deadline in my life. I am very boom, 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 like get stuff done when I have an article. I schedule things out. I like to get stuff done ahead of time. Frankie is the exact opposite. They work best when they're under pressure, and they thrive in that last minute, like kind of chaotic, throw it all together kind of thing. But I never worried about it because we both produced good stuff. And I just knew that that would win out in the end. And actually, our styles kind of meshed that way. And then, like our interests, I did a lot of the history for the book, and they did a lot of the social and analytical side of things. And then we split the teams. There are like so many teams. Like I took half, they took half, and then those were the players we talked to. And then we just wrote on our own time, just like you said about those two guys emailing chapters back and forth. We worked in a Google Doc, so I would throw my stuff in, they would throw their stuff in, and it just sort of came together. I don't know that it always works that well, but for us it did.
That dynamic sounds, Owen and I are both nodding our heads as you talk about that dynamic, as I am
I'm
very much. Yeah, yeah.
I have their process. That is me to a T. It's
Yeah,
like, oh, we got 30 minutes until this is due. This is the best paragraph I'm ever gonna write.
Yeah, sometimes it just works.
I feel like I'm the nagging parent often when I'm just like, Owen, we need to we need to like, we've run out of time. We need to get to work on this. We need to prep this interview. We need to, and he's always like, we're fine. We could just knock it all out. We're chilling. And it works to his credit. But I don't know if we'd get to that point if I wasn't there bugging him every step of the way.
Absolutely not. I also love that Miles asked this question because it at once was a great question for the podcast, but I also know behind the scenes secretly Miles wants to know, we have discussed potentially writing a book one day together. So this is like we're also taking notes here. This is this is helpful to know whether we would ever be able to pull something like that off, because it is daunting.
Yeah, I think, well, I mean, everybody's styles are different. It's just a matter of, can it mesh? Can it work together? And I mean, since you guys are already doing podcasts and stuff together, I'm pretty sure that you'd be fine. And Miles, don't even sweat it, because I would email Frankie too, or like be like, hey, or send a text. So I finished my stuff. When do you think you'll be able to get yours done?
Yeah, yeah. Owen's face is all you need to know for how this dynamic works as well.
I love it. I love it so much. Well, we wanted to kind of tie everything together with grounding us back in the current moment of women's basketball, because like we were so excited to speak to you about all the stuff that we have covered and the history leading up to this moment. our journeys within this space. But I think we're all navigating this rapid, extreme growth in real time in a way of um, discussion, like discussion amongst peers and people who we respect. I think has been like the easiest way to cope with some of the more difficult parts of this growth, and the fact that we are getting this massive influx of people kind of coming into the space in bad faith, and we don't want to be gatekeepy. We love the growth, we love everything about it. These aren't mutually exclusive things. We understand that with this growth, comes more difficult stuff to navigate, but at the same time, none of us quite know how to deal with it, or we're figuring it out in real time, as I said. So I would love to hear how you have been navigating that over the last handful of weeks, months, whatever you feel like it's been since this ridiculous boom, and how you're approaching this WNBA season from a standpoint of storytelling. How can we do our best to kind of combat the nonsense that has been permeating the national media landscape as it pertains to women's basketball? Just how do we do a good job, and how are you approaching this season?
Yeah, I think I'll start with the latter part of your question first. For me, it's about what matters the most, right? It's the basketball, it's the players, and trying to highlight them. Keep doing that, especially like on social media, because it's easy to get lost in the discourse and the toxicity of the discourse. So keep highlighting things that players are doing. I like to drop funny memes every once in a while just to lighten stuff up for myself as well. Um, but yeah, and I've since I left the Athletic in January, so I'm not doing as many features. It's been a nice break because one thing I didn't do while I was there was writing columns, and I've missed that for the past, almost 6 years. And so I've been doing some column writing for Awful Announcing, which I've had a lot of fun with, and just sharing my point of view on media coverage and things like that. So yeah, just kind of, making that the main focus. I always ask myself, what can I contribute to this space that is productive? And I don't always, I'm human. I can get caught up in silly stuff as well, but that's primarily my mindset for, how can I keep helping foster this growth and this conversation in a productive way? But as far as the handling, I heard a quote the other day. Someone was talking about gatekeeping and how, yes, gatekeeping can be like not a great thing, but at the same time, not necessarily a bad thing if you're keeping bad faith actors out of the conversation.
Right.
What's missing most especially because this conversation happens most on social media, let's be honest, is nuance. I try to add a little bit of nuance and keep a healthy perspective. Like multiple things can be true at once. Caitlin Clark is great for the WNBA. She's bringing in billions of eyes, and is part of this explosion. She's an incredible player. She's a generational talent. All the things, But at the same time, she's also a rookie. She's going to have a learning curve. The WNBA has been growing before she came along. The WNBA is full of talented players. I mean, all of these things can be true. Social media, you're going to have a lot of people who they're not there to have a conversation. First of all, you can't have a intelligent back and forth with understanding in 240 characters or whatever it is. It's just not going to happen. So you have to keep that in mind. And then you have to sort of know who's there just to, dredge up stupid stuff in your comments, or who's there really wanting to, learn something or ask a question or have a back and forth that is actually in good faith. And then, take breaks, leave it alone, because it's at some point you realize like it's just not worth it. And it's hard because in what we do, I feel like being active on social media and maintaining a voice is part of maintaining a presence. and staying relevant. So where's the balance with that? Me as somebody who's older, and I tend to think it might be easier for me to kind of just step away than it is for others who especially who need to share podcast clips and videos and be a constant fixture. But it is good to remember to have balance no matter what level you are with it. But yeah, that's pretty much what it comes down to. What can I add that's productive and helpful and beneficial to this overall conversation? And I
I
think
love,
for the most part, we're all doing that,
Yeah.
totally. I love everything you said so much because Miles can attest to this. Like so many of the elements of what you just said, I am talking about with Miles every day. And one of the things, the nuance point is so important. I feel like one of the biggest deflection and distraction tactics is acting like things are mutually exclusive
Yeah.
in the world of social media. And people will, this whole Caitlin Clark conversation and the stupid, just so silly narrative that like WNBA veterans are hating on Caitlin Clark and all this nonsense. There's just no good faith willingness to acknowledge that both the fact that Caitlin is generational and so good for the league, and also the flip side of that, and how we have to be intentional about coverage and honoring everyone. Uh, those things, those things are not opposed. They're not opposed, but Twitter will make you think like they are, and so it's really refreshing to be able to have conversations and talk about these things because we're also passionate about it and yeah, stepping away from Twitter can be difficult for sure in our profession.
Yeah.
Yeah. And oh, go
Yeah.
ahead.
I was just going to say to another point that you brought up about the fact that we have to be active, that we're like building brands because this is how we get eyeballs, not just from fans, but from other outlets that we could write for and everything like that. But it's always, and I've joked to Owen about this before, it's always so funny to me how I can, if I tweet something that is not about women's basketball, it's just absolute crickets. Like I can talk about like the Knicks being on a playoff run that they haven't been on since the 90s, and I will get zero engagement. But then I could just be like, here's a picture of Brianna Stewart. And I'm watching hundreds of likes come in. And it's just really funny. So I'm like, yeah, I've succeeded. But also finding that I'm also a person behind on the other side of this. Sometimes that feels like those lines get kind of blurred. But maybe that's for the best because when it is time to disconnect, I know that is something that I can compartmentalize and say, yes, I have to be really online for this, but sometimes I could just drop the quote that I got in post game, and then I can go away and come back a couple hours later and just pick up the conversation wherever it is because it is now ongoing all the time.
Yes, it's so true. I don't know if this is because, Twitter has changed so much, or X, or whatever you want to call it, but it didn't used to be like that. I used to throw in tweets about R&B or like other things I'm interested in, and still get some back and forth or whatever. But now you're right. It's just, unless it's almost like it's been separated into different echo chambers, and ours is the WNBA women's basketball space, right? And so that's all people in our little echo chamber want to hear about or want to engage with. And um in some cases, like, yeah, when you share a podcast clip, or when I share an article or a column or something, that works in our favor. But then in the other, it's like almost exhausting because it feels like that it's the same conversation 24/7. So again, I don't know, there's the whole balance with it. And you know trying to find out, okay, when is it time to share my thoughts on this, or maybe I don't need to add to this conversation.
Yeah, we've had you answering all these like really, really some existential questions about what we're doing, and also just like these questions about the history and the evolution and all these really, really deep thought answers. So before we get you out of here, we just want to like put the present in front of you and just very simply, what's a team that you've enjoyed watching in the early, we're only 2 weeks in or whatever, but in the early stretch of this WNBA season? It could be someone you are anticipating, someone who surprised you, but who's just been a really fun watch for you.
I like Phoenix. And full disclosure, because people ask me all this time, like, who's your favorite team? And I don't tend to have one now that I cover the league on a regular basis. But I grew up a Phoenix Mercury fan, and honestly, I didn't know. You never know when you see the roster on paper how it's all going to come together. Especially when you have two, alphas like Diana Taurasi and Kalia Copper on the team. Man, and then Natasha Cloud fitting right in at point guard, leading the league in assists. Like, it is just, there is a blend there. And I think it's part of the offensive style that they play with, that, fast pace, that green light. I think that's something Diana has always thrived in, but so does Copper. Like, um, and even without BG, with BG being hurt, Natasha Mack coming out of nowhere. I mean, they've just been so fun to watch. And then, I keep saying this, but I really like what I've seen out of Leah Edwards. I know she's not putting up mind-blowing stats, but man, she has been consistent since that first game. Like, her transition to me out of all the rookies from the start has seemed so seamless to me. Like, she just went from one level to the next. And I mean, yeah, there's some things you could nitpick here and there, but I feel like she's just been really consistent. And all the rookies have been fun to watch. I don't think there's a clear-cut rookie of the year like there was going in last season with Leah. And Caitlin Clark fans were already mad at me for saying that after 2 games into the season, but I'm like, this is wide open here. But yeah, I'd have to say if I had to pick one team, it's Phoenix.
That's a lot
I
of
love
fun.
the Phoenix answer. Ka's my favorite player, and I do think
Oh,
that
I
they're
know this.
yeah. I mean, it's like
You hide it well.
I don't really hide that one very well, I guess. But I feel like with her and Natasha Cloud, there's a Philly energy in the building with that backcourt that is perfect for Diana. Like, I feel like Diana has been waiting for the competitiveness that those two are bringing in, which is not at all a knock on anyone previously. Like, they have had super competitive, super talented players. They were just in the finals 3 years ago and lost to Ka. But that's how it goes. But you're seeing that. I feel like just watching them and getting, as you said, a Natasha Mack to come in and just be exceptional defensively and totally hold her own, has been so fun to watch. It's what Diana deserves in the end of her career, is like players who now have surpassed her in the current moment of what they can do production wise on the court. But it's that energy, it's that feeling, it's just that that competitiveness that I think you see in Ka and Tosh, that has been really, really fun to watch.
Yeah, I agree completely. I love it. And Diana Taurasi's like busy taking that Tom Brady elixir, to help keep her youthful and her about to be 42. I mean, it's mind blowing. It is mind blowing. What is she? Does she lead the league in 3-pointers made right now? I think she does.
Yeah, I mean, that whole team, I feel like, is at the top of that leaderboard.
Yeah, that's true.
All of them are just nonstop knocking down threes. It's a really fun, and with BG's injury, I really didn't know what to expect. When we covered Beck Allen for years here in New York, and I thought her at the 4 was taking away from what she does best, which is just picking up the best perimeter player and using that length. And the transition that they committed to just, basically 4 out, and then Tosh Mack just goes in the middle and just kind of cleans up all the messes. And that's been working. And yeah, you could add BG back to that soon. See how that works. So they've been really fun. That's a great team to call out, and one that, yeah, when we go and relitigate free agency at the end of the year, we'll see how everything kind of shook out, because there was so much movement this year. But Lyndsey, thank you so much. This was, like you said at the top, this was overdue. A great conversation. Thank you for letting us pick your brain, because we've looked up to you, or at least I'll speak for myself, but as long as I've been in this space, and it was really awesome to finally connect. And hopefully we see you come down to the city, come down to a Liberty game. Hopefully we can catch you down there. But thank you for this. And is there anything that you want to plug or share about thoughts or work you've got recent or coming out, or just, yeah, general anything really?
Yeah, I mean, I've been doing some fun stuff. I just finished writing every year since 2022, I think. I've been doing content for the WNBA mode for NBA 2K. And I wrapped that up in the spring, and there's some cool stuff, some cool elements to the game coming out that I think people are going to really love. And I won't tell you who they're thinking about putting on the cover just yet. um,
They get me
yeah,
every year. Every year I'm like, "Ah, I'm not going to buy another game." And then there's like one cool feature and I'm like, okay, come on. You got me.
oh yeah, you might want to check this out. I can't say what it is yet, but yeah, and then I'm working on another book proposal. It's cool having being able to work on some different projects and some different things with different people, and um, I've just been having fun, like I said, writing the columns for Awful Announcing, and I've got some other stuff in the works. So I'll be around, not going anywhere just yet.
Amazing, amazing. That's great news to us and to everyone listening, I'm sure. Lyndsey, thank you so much, and we will hopefully pull up with you again soon.
Yeah, that would be great.
Thank you.